Good morning, good day, and good afternoon, gentlemen. In today's lesson, we will be revisiting the sentence. So let's get straight into it. Write in full sentences, your teachers often tell you. But remind me again, sir, what is a full sentence? And what's not a full sentence? Let's start with what a sentence is not. Not every group of words is a sentence. Some learners still haven't grasped this concept, and they believe that you can just slap a group of words together that sort of means something and hope for the best. To be a sentence, a group of words must make sense on their own, and the sentence must contain 1, a subject, and secondly, a finite verb. In my explanation in the previous slide, I mentioned two concepts we should all be familiar with at this stage in our schooling careers: the subject and the verb. What is a subject? Well, the subject is the person or thing that carries out the action of the verb. In order to check whether you have a subject, you ask who or what before the verb. Okay. And what's a verb, please, sir? A verb is a word that tells us what the subject is doing or being. In primary school, you may have called the verb the doing word. There are two kinds of verbs. Firstly, we get the action verb, and that includes words like run, jump, read, taste, play. And the second type of verb refers to being verbs. These are also referred to as state of being verbs, but for our purposes we can just use the short version, which is being verbs. And that includes words like am, is, was, and seem. Let's have a look at a practical example. The boy kicked the ball. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, in order to check whether you have a subject, you must ask who or what before the verb. In this example, the verb, also known as the doing word, is kicked. If we ask who or what is doing the kicking, then we quickly discover that the boy is doing the kicking, and therefore the boy is the subject. Now it's time for a quick exercise. You've been provided with an example. The children ate the birthday cake. The instructions are as follows. Underline the subject and circle or highlight the verb. Firstly, we have to underline the subject, which is the thing or the person or the people doing the verb. In this instance, it's the children who are doing the verb, and obviously the verb is ate. So we underline the children and we highlight ate. Now at this moment, you need to please pause the video and go and do the rest of the exercise on this slide. Your teacher has either instructed you to complete the Google Doc attached on Google Classroom, or she has instructed you to do the exercise in your exercise books. Complete the exercise and then come back and press play to continue watching the presentation. Well done. By now you have completed the exercise and you can mark your own work to confirm that you still do understand and remember what a subject is and what a verb is. In the first example, Thabiso and Lerato are the subject and hate is the verb. Elizabeth is the subject in the second example and was is the verb. Why is angry not a verb? Which part of speech is that? Maybe you can discuss this amongst your friends and find out why angry is not a verb and which part of speech it is then if it is not a verb. In example 3, the man is the thing or the person that is doing the doing, so therefore the man is the subject. And is chewing is the verb. Now chewing cannot stand alone. it needs a helping or an auxiliary verb to turn it into a finite verb. And that is why is chewing is the verb. We'll get back to this shortly. The strict headmaster is the verb, and scowled is the action, which is the verb. The rowing boat is the subject, and was tossed about is the verb. James is the subject, and seemed is the verb. We've given you an additional exercise for you to test and see whether you understand the difference between an action verb or a being verb. In the example you have been given, you can see that we have underlined ran as the verb, and it is an action verb. Please do the exercises on this page. Once again, your teacher will have either instructed you to complete the exercises on the Google Doc attached to your Google Classroom or in your books. Please follow whichever instruction you were given. And here are the answers to the exercise. Please press pause, mark your work, and make sure that you understand the difference between action and being verbs. Despite having both a subject and a verb, the following do not qualify as complete sentences. Can you explain why? Well, I'll explain to you guys. The first two would be full sentences in that they do both have a subject. In both cases, the subject is he, and a finite verb. The finite verb is called. However, they begin with a subordinating conjunction, which means that they are therefore subordinate clauses in a larger compound sentence. Now we'll get to compound sentences a bit later in the lesson, but it's useful to start thinking about that right now. The last sentence is not a full sentence because calling is a present participle and not a finite verb. Remember, we said that the two fundamental building blocks of a sentence are, firstly, a subject, and secondly, a finite verb. Therefore, although it looks like the sentence has a subject and a verb, it is not a finite verb. In order to be a finite verb, the present participle must have a tense. And to get a tense, it needs an auxiliary verb, also known as a helping verb, like is or was. Then would be he is calling, and he would be the subject, and is calling would be the finite verb. We have learned by now that a sentence must begin with a capital letter and end with a full stop. It is useful to note that exclamation marks and question marks already have a full stop underneath them. Please rewrite this text conversation in standard English. Once again, you'll either complete this on the Google Doc or in your exercise books. Please press pause, complete the exercise, and then come and watch the rest of the presentation. The next two slides contain extracts from the book Holes, and they are written without full stops. Can you divide the words into sentences? Please draw a full stop where you think one sentence ends and another begins. Press pause when you get to the slide. Complete the exercise either on the Google Doc once again or in your class workbooks, and then press play when you are done punctuating both extracts. A friendly reminder of the building blocks of a sentence. Firstly, it must contain a subject. It must contain a verb, but not just any verb. It must be a finite verb. So it's a bit naughty of this poster not to have the word finite because it's quite important. And of course, it must be able to stand on its own. We now move on to types of sentences. we get three types of sentences. The first type is the simple sentence. A simple sentence contains a subject and a finite verb and expresses a complete thought. A simple sentence can also be called a main clause. So whenever you hear the word main clause or simple sentence, just remember that it's referring to the same thing. In the example we've given you, we've said, I ran to the store. Another version could be, John and I ran to the store. It's useful to note that simple sentences can contain compound subjects. Mr. Ngema, what's a compound sentence? Well, compound just means that the subject is composed of two or more separate elements. In this case, the two elements are both John and I. The second type of sentence is the compound sentence. The compound sentence is made up of two main clauses or two simple sentences, which are joined by a coordinating conjunction. Remember now that the main clause can stand on its own. So if you want to test whether a sentence is a main clause, you need to put it on its own and see if it still meets the requirements of a complete sentence. The coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. A helpful hint in trying to remember all of them is that the first letter of each of these coordinators spells fanboys. F obviously for, A for and so forth. And the example you've been given is, I ran to the store and bought milk. We can clearly see that this is made up of two sentences which can stand on their own. So there are two main clauses. I ran to the store is a complete sentence on its own. It's got a subject, I, it's got a finite verb, ran, and it can stand on its own. It doesn't require another clause to help it to make sense. I bought milk is in the same position. I is the subject, bought is a finite verb, and it makes complete sense on its own. I bought milk. It does not require any other clause to help us to make sense of it. The third and final type of sentence is the complex sentence. Now, a complex sentence contains one main clause and one or more subordinate clauses which provide additional information. So what is a subordinate clause? A subordinate clause, also known as a dependent clause, and I like the definition dependent clause because it tells us that on its own it cannot stand. It relies on another clause to help it to make sense. So a subordinate clause always contains a verb but cannot stand alone. It is dependent on the main clause for its meaning. Now, when you get the complex sentence, you will have the main clause being joined to the subordinate clause by a subordinating conjunction. The main clause can be at the beginning of the sentence or can be at the end and be the final clause. It can get a bit tricky when the order is mixed around, but as long as you remember the rules of what makes up a main clause, you shouldn't get confused. And the example we've given you is, I ran to the store because we were out of milk. I ran to the store is a complete sentence. It is the main clause. It doesn't rely on any other sentence to help it to have meaning. Whereas we were out of milk cannot stand on its own. I ran to the store after finishing my homework. The clause finishing my homework is not a complete sentence. It doesn't make sense on its own. And that's why it requires a main clause and is dependent on the main clause to give it its meaning. And of course, the main clause is I ran to the store. And then in the third example, we've just switched them around to show you how the main clause can come at the beginning or can be the final clause. On this table, you are given a list of subordinating conjunctions, which serve as an indicator that a subordinate clause is present in a sentence. Next up on the menu are incomplete sentences. As you can read on the slide here, a fragment is a small piece of something. And likewise, a sentence fragment is just a piece of a sentence that has become detached or separated from the main clause. The first group of incomplete sentences are the ones which omit or leave out the main clause. These sentence fragments often begin with a subordinating conjunction. And an example we've been given is because he ran out of data. Now that's a fragment, it's incomplete. It requires a main clause. It is dependent on the main clause to help it to have meaning and make sense. And that's why I prefer calling the subordinate clauses dependent clauses, because dependent tells us that it requires something else, and that something else is the main clause. The second group of incomplete sentences are the ones which do not have a main clause that contains a subject. Grade 8 and 9 boys enjoy doing this. Actually, in fact, boys of all grades and young people and adults of all ages often do this. And an example of this is running onto the field excited about the game. To many of us, that sounds like a complete sentence. However, it needs a subject to make it complete. Alistair ran onto the field excited about the game. Weaving dangerously through the traffic on the highway. Once again, we are missing a subject. And once you add Bongani in there, everything is A-OK. You have yourself a complete sentence. The third group of incomplete sentences are those which are made up of additional information that does not make sense on its own. And in the first example, you have, with my friends Sibu and Robbie. Well, what were you guys doing? There's no verb. And the second example we have there is such as bloopers and deleted scenes. Once again, that is just additional information and it requires the main clause to come in, give it some meaning. The DVD has some great additional features, such as bloopers and deleted scenes. And there we have ourselves a complete sentence. And now comes the juicy part of the lesson, the part we've all been waiting for. It's time for us to go and do some mental gymnastics. Please do the following exercises either on the Google Doc provided by your teacher or in your exercise books. Happy gymming and goodbye. Good luck.